I don't know that necessarily people are speaking for the Torah. They're speaking for themselves. They're speaking using their own experience, using their own, interpretations of life through their own individual experience. That's I think a lot of people, for me, I had to kind of go on that journey of reframing, like, okay, wait a second, like the reason why these commentaries are saying this, like what was the life they were living, what was the culture looking like at the time, like there are influences. And I think that to negate that and to say like, oh, just because they're Jewish commentators means that they have the utmost supreme say is not necessarily true. I think that it's a beautiful expression. I think that it was intended by God because, otherwise I don't think it would be, or it wouldn't have such a prevalent presence throughout the generations. But I think that, considering the sources and considering their interpretations really does shape, because that could make or break someone's experience with spiritual growth or the pursuit of truth by saying or believing that just one person's or a group of people's opinion based off of their own experience or their own influences is truth. That would also be very concerning. That would be also very confusing. Look, we were talking about feminine and masculine and the balance and maybe overpowering of the other in terms of Mashiach, that I've heard a nevuah regarding the sun and the moon, how those are kind of like these metaphors of masculine and feminine energy, and that the moon will become bigger than the sun because the divine presence will take over the masculine.
I'm familiar with becoming equal.
Oh, really? I've heard that the moon overpowers.
Or alavana or hashemesh or shavasi meberishis. I'm not familiar with any quotes of it being bigger. I do think that's what's happening right now, is the moon is trying to overpower.
It's not trying if it's working. It's succeeding.
In Kabbalah, eventually it's what's called shtei melachim b'keser echad. 2 kings, 1 crown.
That doesn't sound good.
Like you equal out. No, it's a good thing. That means we're both, in other words, if you think about it, in a healthy household, right?
Yeah.
The father isn't above the mother's not above the father. It's 2 of them ruling together. So it's called shtei melachim b'keser echad. It's 2 rulers with one crown. Like they have the same goal, same focus. Yeah. You also pointed out something really, really interesting, which is the Yosef, who we're saying now is like masculine, also has a bunch of feminine traits, and David HaMelech, we're saying is feminine, also has a bunch of masculine traits, which I think is a very valid point. And it's the ideal masculine has these feminine traits, the ideal feminine has these masculine traits, which is, it's like the yin yang, it's the dot inside, right? You have the black and the white that are merging into each other, but then in the black there's that white, and in the white there's that black. So it's really the interplay. It's something, it's a fascinating concept to think about. There you go.
Nachon. Right, it's like the Sfirot. Like I feel like it keeps driving back to that point, that the more I learn about Gevurah, the more I see Chesed in it, and the more and for all of the Midot, but specifically between that balance, and even like the masculine and feminine side of that, the more that we learn about one thing, the more we see the other within it, which is a beautiful thing also, like seeing the impact, even with people, right? Like you could meet someone or you could speak with someone randomly or after long periods of time, and slowly but surely the effects of that person are manifested through your own expressions. And I think even that is a beautiful metaphor of Hashem kind of an interplaying in our life, that kind of that bochen, what was the word you said? Bechina?
Bechina, yeah.
Yeah, the bechina of godliness. The more we get to know ourselves, the more that we get to know other people, the more we, cheesy as it is, the more we get to know God. And I think that's just the most loving and kindest thing. It's taking this esoteric, abstract, distanced idea of what, energetic power has ruling over my life, and seeing it in the people that I love and care about, and seeing it in the beauties of the world that, translate and resonate with me. I think that's just, I don't know, the sweetest and most intimate thing that godly energy could do,
Yeah. By the way, something I said before as we were getting cut off, I don't know if you heard it, but that idea of the sun and the moon, that the moon's going to be just as strong as the sun. if you take that literally, I'm sure there are some scientists out there saying that's actually impossible because the moon doesn't even have its own light. It's only reflecting the light of the sun. So how could it possibly be, right?
Mm-hmm.
But again, if you understand that these are just deeper concepts that they're using this terminology for, and we're not talking about the moon, we're not talking about the sun, we're not talking about men and women, right? We're talking about these spiritual concepts, these
Mm-hmm.
divine realities, then everything goes smoothly. That's one of the reasons why I fell out of favor, shall we say? No, I stopped listening to Sam Harris, is because he takes everything in like this literal sense, and then he picks it apart, and he refuses to acknowledge that maybe there's this deeper message here that we're just giving over with this
Mm-hmm.
terminology. There's actually a Ramchal that I saw brought down who discusses the Talmudic passages in which the rabbis discuss astronomy and they are incorrect with
Mm.
the actual calculations, like the actual what's going on in the heavens. And he
Like
says it
biblical
really doesn't
astronomers?
matter. No, they describe the Talmudic sages, in other words, discuss something that's going on in astronomy, and they're actually wrong on the science, on the calculations. So how do
Oh,
you deal with
interesting.
that, right? And what the Ramchal says is nobody cares because they couldn't care less about astronomy. They're trying to give over a concept, and they're giving over that concept
Mm.
veiled in the terminology of the day, of the science of the day. In other words, it would be like me trying to explain to
Mm-hmm.
you, right, that I feel like we're going round and round in circles, and I say like, listen, I'm standing here, and it's like the Earth with the sun just round and round and round, right? You're just going round
Mm-hmm.
and round in circles. Now, the fact that that's not the way that it works, that the Earth is spinning and looks to us like the sun is going around, but really we're turning, is irrelevant. I'm trying to say that you're going around, and if I have to say the sun's going around in circles, the Earth is going around, I'm just trying to say we're going around in circles. That's it.
Right.
I don't care who's going around. You're going around in the circle, not the sun, not the Earth, not the this. And we just lose it
Right.
in like the metaphor, and we're like, technically, right?
But I think that maybe that's people's intentions, is that sometimes by taking it literally, it is avoiding that, you know, cryptic, pragmatic way of understanding things through metaphor, through, symbolisms, that like it can really get lost.
So I like to give the devil its due. So
Okay.
I'm not convinced that these people aren't very well intentioned. The problem is that if we give everything, it's sort of what Jordan Peterson discusses as far as the postmodernist reading of things. There's an infinite amount of way to
Uh-huh.
read things, to read any script. So what do you do with that? Because essentially we're reading into the script more than we're reading out of the script, right? So do scripts have any
Mm.
intrinsic meaning? That's a problem. So Sam Harris deals with that by going about it like a very pragmatic way, by saying I'm going to read it and take everything literally, and I'm not going to read anything more into it than exactly what's written, and that's it. But obviously, it's not how people have ever understood the text. If you go through historically, I mean, just off the bat, at the end
Um,
of Likutei Moharan, one of the last pieces,
mhm.
Rabbi Nachman says that when you read Tehillim, you should take it all as like your own struggles internally.
Mhm.
Don't think of it as these wars going on externally.
Mhm. Sorry, it's just interesting. Also, takes me back to the sun and moon balance of just um, living in a society now, following kind of the logic of what you were saying, and the logic, I guess, of what different interpretations will say about different texts, is that it's essentially saying that the interpretation of the source is now becoming at the same level as the source. And so when you follow the metaphor of the sun and moon, it's the sun is the source of light and the moon is reflexive of that light. And so now they're coming to a place of equity. It's not one overpowering the other, but they both have this balance between the two of them. It's a very redemptive, prophetic way that we're leading, which is very cool.
Yeah, wow. You can say essentially, I'm not sure if this is literally what you're saying, and I'm just spelling it out more, but this is what I heard. But again, it
Oh,
could be I'm just
please.
reading into what you're saying. And
Which
but essentially the
that's what we
Torah would
do.
be essentially the Torah would be the sun and we would be the moon.
Mm-hmm.
But that's scientifically that's problematic. You understand that? In other words, I agree with Sam Harris that there's a problem here on a certain level,
Mm-hmm.
which is now the other thing with Sam Harris is he feels like people are constantly changing the bar. They're constantly moving the bar. Because if I start off
Mm-hmm.
and I say, listen, the Torah clearly says the world is 5,700 years old, and then you come back to me and you're like, it's way older, and you're like, then I can somehow find the Maimer Chazal. I'll be like, okay, it's way older, and then you come back and you're like, it's even older
Right.
than that, and then I keep moving the bar, and it comes across as like not a very genuine, honest
Mm-hmm.
discussion. Right? It's important to get to the depth in the beginning, though, and to understand that like this is more complex than we make it out to be, and we're trying to figure out what's going on and leave things a little bit open. It's like I used to tell Simchi when we would talk, I would say uh, the more flexible it is, the less likely it is to break. Right. So if you just have
Sure.
this flexibility when you're learning and trying to understand, and you're searching for the truth, and it doesn't have to, you don't have to limit it, then your version of God and spirituality and religion is less likely to break. And if you have a very rigid version of like this is what it
Mm-hmm.
is, this is what it means, then it's very likely to just shatter against reality in the face of reality.
Mm. I think even following that metaphor of flexibility, I don't know why the image of those bendy rulers came into my head, but it's like that is exactly it though. It's like that's the definition or manifestation of truth or godliness or just that universal like power, I guess, that people can then relate to their lives is kind of like there's that straight line, but if it's flexible it can become that circle that is overflowing and flexible and kind of open for interpretation, but it also has the ability to be that yeshar, straight, consistent reality that I think people, human nature, spirituality also calls for. I think we need it. I don't think to say that just life is or spirituality or the pursuit of spirituality is satisfied with just flexibility. I think that we also really need that straightness and that pashut, kind of upfront truth that isn't contradicted and is concrete. So seeing that balance between something that can be bended, but in essence is that straight. For me, that's like
On a certain
how I
level,
feel like I need it.
I feel like the script kind of Torah Shebiktav, Torah Shebiksav,
Mm-hmm.
that is the straightness. But then obviously our way of interpreting it, which Torah Shebal Peh, that kind of keeps evolving. There's always new Torahs. Now, obviously, the script hasn't
Mm-hmm.
changed,
Right.
but the way we're interpreting it, the way we're applying it, the way we're understanding it, that keeps growing until Mashiach, when we have like the ultimate Torah officially from like the
Mm.
Razin Sathimin, like the highest dimension, the highest level. But I think that there's something there that's important to understand in general,
Mm-hmm.
because I think it's when you understand that on a certain level, people are speaking for the Torah. It's not speaking for itself. That's really when you can get to the
Mm-hmm.
truth and the understanding, and that's really when you can get down the deepest to really understand the core concepts, and then from there you could really have a firm foundation. And I think essentially this is what prophets did throughout the ages, because usually I
Mm.
refuse to acknowledge that Jews were saying, I'm going to do something that's evil. I think that usually what happens is people were saying, this is really what it means. Like, this is okay, right? This is not a big deal.
Mm. I heard actually that's like kind of the worst kind of avera is an avera that you can convince yourself is a mitzvah, that like you can justify and adapt in your head or in, whatever way.
Well, essentially, I think that's what we're all doing. And even Chazal even say, "Kivan she'avar v'ta nasas lo keheter." If a person does sin and then he repeats it, it becomes like it's mutter to him. Like in his head, like we
Yeah.
justify things. And in order, also Brett Weinstein and Jordan Peterson speak about this on Joe Rogan. In order to really create commit like a serious atrocity, you have to think that you're in the right. Otherwise, you can't do it. Like, you can't get that far unless you're convinced that what you're doing is right. And it's important to acknowledge that and try to understand where that perception comes from. That way we can dispel it, kind of. And instead, what a lot of people are doing is kind of avoiding it and pretending like, oh, he knows he's wrong. No, he doesn't. No, he doesn't. He thinks he's right. And so do you. And I'm not so sure that you're the right one and he's the wrong one.
The existential crisis considered. Yeah, I think that, I mean, that's the truth also, though, for Torah interpretation. It's hard for me because I think that the more commentaries and interpretations, it's, I don't know that necessarily people are speaking for the Torah, they're speaking for themselves. They're speaking using their own experience, using their own, interpretations of life through their own individual experience. That's like, I think a lot of people, for me, I had to kind of go on that journey of reframing, like, okay, wait a second, like the reason why these commentaries are saying this, like what was the life they were living, what was the culture looking like at the time, like there are influences. And I think that to negate that and to say like, oh, just because they're Jewish commentators means that they have the utmost supreme say is not necessarily true. I think that it's a beautiful expression. I think that it was intended by God because, otherwise I don't think it would be, or it wouldn't have such a prevalent presence throughout the generations. But I think that, considering the sources and considering their interpretations really does shape, because that could make or break someone's experience with spiritual growth or the pursuit of truth by saying or believing that just one person's or a group of people's opinion based off of their own experience or their own influences is truth. That would also be very concerning. That would be also very confusing. So it's as to not have the moon overpower the sun.
Yeah, it's a nice way of putting it.
Thanks.
Yeah, it's always important, and there's also different opinions, even if we're not negating one opinion, but very often there are other opinions that should also be taken into account. What happens very often is we learn the commentary. Let's say we learn one commentary and we confuse the commentary with the writing very often, with the original text. I had a rabbi actually in 10th grade in Scranton, Rabbi Pritzker, Rabbi Nachman Pritzker, who would give a test every year on Megillas Esther to ask people what's actually written in the text. Because growing up, you hear so many stories, and there's kids' books, and there's recordings, and there's tapes, and there's with a ton of like Midrashim, and like what's written in the text. And he's like, no one ever gets 100.
Oh my gosh.
Which is like fascinating. He's like, it's never. Yeah. I was talking to my older brother also when I was back in America a couple months ago, and he was a little upset also about all the midrashim that are being taught to little kids. And he's like, you have to understand what the midrashim do or don't mean. But even the simplest thing, he was talking about like Avram Avinu being thrown into a burning fire, into a kivshan ha'esh, into the fire. That's not actually written in the pasuk. And it's something that as kids, it's like, that's part of that's the funnest story, Yeah. And it's like, even I did a double take. I'm like, well, you're right. It's not actually there. Like but it's such ingrained, and he totally doesn't understand it literally. He's absolutely refuses to understand it literally. I'm a little more of a meditating, tripping, whatever. Like I can accept that it's literal. Right.
Interesting. Yeah.
I can accept. He cannot accept that it's literal, and that's more than okay with me. I'm not so sure it is literal, but certain things. This is also a weird dichotomy. Certain things can have a literal manifestation also in my head. Like it might also be literal, and in other words, David HaMelech probably fought these wars, but we're also supposed to read it as our internal struggles, right? At the same time, there are certain things like Agadah Gemaras, certain Talmudic passages, which there is no way that's literal. There's certain midrashim that there's no way. One of my old Rosh Yeshiva, Chaim Bressler, used to like talking about this, and he would say if the Midrash says that Adam HaRishon stood on earth and his head reached all the way up to the sun, or something like that. He's like, if you do the math, the distance from the earth to the sun, and you measure the circumference of the earth, he wouldn't have been able to be buried here. Right? So he's like, of course it's not literal.
Well, yeah, also even, yeah, just in itself that's so interesting because I feel like Midrash has been utilized for explaining so many things. And like, for me, even like what you bring up, Megillat Esther, like, for me, it's also, I had like the craziest shock of my life of there's been this vilified idea of Vashti, but following the text, it's like, there's no her growing a tail or that, it's just she refused to go present herself in front of Achashverosh's party. So it's interesting. Like, I don't know enough to defend Vashti or whatever it is, but I think that it's kind of, I don't know. There's kind of also this, maybe I'm scared to say unfair balance, but between using midrash in order to justify or solidify or support a claim about a person in Tanakh or a person in Jewish thought in general. It's just interesting because I feel like it's kind of like sometimes we say, oh, well, no, it's midrash, so it can make sense, or it's midrash, discredit it altogether. And I think there has to be kind of this holding of accountability for what midrash is and what it represents. And I think that if there's just an acceptance that it's a beautiful thing, that it adds color and light and humanity to different situations, and it might be crazy out there supernatural, but that highlights a certain core point that some things are just supernatural, and as much as we try to find logic in them and make them more tangible, that's just what it is. And but the opposite is true as well, is that like taking something that may have a logic explanation, with Abraham and being thrown into a fiery furnace, like, yeah, maybe that the feeling of firing burning is often associated with being embarrassed or being kind of like challenged or whatever it is. So that internal battle, that internal fire, it's interesting that sometimes isn't enough. That doesn't make him as heroic or as miraculously chosen by God, that maybe little kids need to see when they learn about Abraham Avinu and all these biblical stories. So it's fascinating because it really is one of those tools that could really build or destroy midrash. So I have an interesting relationship with midrash. I don't know.
Yeah, I think there's also a fascinating concept of the idea of Torah dibra kalashon bnei adam, as the Torah talks, in the words of humans. Because it's funny, we would say, oh, that guy went through fire. That guy went through fire and brimstone, and he made it out alive. That's actually the way we talk, which is comical. But somehow when we read that, we're like, wow, he went through a fire and brimstone and he survived? Whoa! Right. Like why are we assuming like that idea of Kamfei Nesharim, right? The wings of eagles or vultures or whatever bird it would be.
Right.
That so right off the bat, Rashi understands it as it just being a term of haste. Like we're going to go to Israel on wings of, right? But from my current vantage point, I think it's very simple to me that it means some sort of flying device, like an airplane or something.
Right, airplane.
because you can't expect the prophet when he sees an airplane in a dream to write down, what do you want him to write?
Right.
So if you want to say somebody went through hell, right? Then what do you write? He went through hell? What does that mean to anyone if you're trying to write these words? So you would say, oh, he went through like the most scorching fire and he came out. It's just a way of talking. And it's not even like a poetic necessarily way of talking. It's just like expressions. I don't know what the correct term for it would be in English, and the fact that we label it in, again, this goes back like to the female and male part where we're like, oh, the female versus the male versus, like, you didn't go out of Mitzrayim. You went through your own, struggles. And it's like, it's the same thing. It's just a term of talking.
Right. I think it's born out of the human desire and need to make things understandable. I talk about this a lot. I used to work with gap year students, and a lot of them when talking about God, a lot of it was about finding logic in that. If it doesn't make sense, like how, if I knew with concrete proof, like show me kind of in front of me, A plus B equals C, that God exists, then I'll believe in God. But right now, and it's interesting because it's so subjective. Like, me personally, I can see God's proof in a lot of different ways, and other people see it in their ways. And it's all kind of this like pursuit of understanding and kind of a logical explanation to something that is supernatural. So I think that with but also natural at the same time. It's like interesting. It's kind of, I don't know, not held by the boundaries of natural versus supernatural, but kind of what you're talking about of taking the words and trying to interpret them in ways that fit into kind of a logic or through a certain understanding, I think is also kind of maybe a false security of like, you know, what something that I would talk about with these, you know, questioning and curious people is that knowledge isn't necessarily a validation of security. You know, it's not like, oh, now that I know with 100% certainty, now I can believe, now I can kind of trust fall into that. Like that kind of erases the premise of belief, and belief to me isn't a limiting experience. I don't think that it holds me back from any sort of insight or enlightenment. You know, I think that we've talked about this a lot before about I think it's Aristotle's cave of is it Aristotle? Plato, nice. Plato's cave of kind of this pursuit of knowledge and understanding and awareness of the world around. Like, it's fascinating to me because I could see that the same as drawing closer to belief. That, you know, coming out of the cave isn't necessarily seeing it with 100% certainty, but it's seeing it, I guess, not in the conventional way of 100% certainty.
It's a lot. Yeah. There's a lot there.
Sorry.
There's a lot there. One of the things that you reminded me of right off the bat was this idea of like, what do you mean by true? And I've heard Jordan Peterson talk about this a lot. It's one of, I think, the best clips is, well, I don't know what you mean by true, right? Do you mean literally true? Like what do you mean? Like, are these but they're conceptually, they're like meta truths is the way he words it, kind of. Some of these concepts, they're conceptually true. You can stand up to power and they can put you through fire, and sometimes you can come out and prevail, and then people will see that and then they'll be inspired to stand up also, right? And not everyone will make it through. Some people will get put in the fire and they won't make it through. But at the end of the day, even then, you should still stand up to power for what you believe in. And then again, what do you mean by belief? And what do you mean by God? All these things need definitions in order to, because this is the debate between Sam Harris and Jordan Peterson. Sam Harris is like, I don't believe in a rabbi in the sky, right? Long bearded grandfather. And Jordan's like, neither do I. And then Sam's like, right. Well, that's what everyone's thinking in their head when they say God. And Jordan's like, well, not me. I'm thinking about the truth and the ultimate reality and the objective whatever's here, right? The source code of the matrix. And like he gives all these spiritual, deep, psychedelic versions of what he means by God. And he's like, that I believe in. And Sam is like, that's nice, but that's not what everyone else means when they say the word God. So these concepts are so vague. I had this realization also a while back about Geulah, about reincarnation, that I asked once a Kabbalist that there are opinions that Geulah doesn't exist, that reincarnation is not a thing. There are opinions that reincarnation is a thing, right? So I'm like, according to the opinions that reincarnation is not real, doesn't happen. All these people who are saying all these Torahs about reincarnation, they're just like, they're tripping, you know? Like you're reading in all these understandings and all these connections where they're not meant to be there. You're connecting spots that are not meant to be connected. Like, what do you do with that? And he looked at me and he's like, don't worry, reincarnation is real, right? And I'm like, okay, but you didn't really answer my question. And then at one point, I was up north together with Bernie and Tani and his whole chevra. For those people who know, you'll know. For like Pesach. And suddenly I realized, again, it depends. And suddenly I realized, like, so I was hanging out with that crowd who they're incredibly deep. And suddenly I realized it depends again how you define your terms. So if you asked me, did Yitzy Fink live a couple hundred years ago and then he came back right now? No. Right? If you say, am I acting out a role right now that has been acted out before in history? I would say yes. And a certain idea in Egypt also, they went with this, that like every pharaoh was a reincarnation of the last pharaoh, kind of. But they didn't mean that the soul from the last pharaoh died and came back. They meant that baby was born. He assumed the pharaoh position. On a certain level, you could say every secretary is a reincarnation of the last secretary, because they're my secretary.
Mm-hmm.
She was my secretary, and he was my secretary, and they were my secretary, and now this is my secretary. The secretary position stays on, but the
Mm-hmm.
person in it changes. And a certain level, that you could say that's, you can understand reincarnation that way. And if you understand it that way, in every generation there's a Mashiach, doesn't mean that each Mashiach in every generation is a reincarnation of the Mashiach from the last generation. He's just the same
I
Bechina,
think that's
kind of.
Nachon. That's even like exactly what I was thinking of, kind of bringing it back to that a little bit. That like what you were saying before of, I don't know who you were quoting, but I don't remember, but that Mashiach ben Yosef doesn't necessarily need to die because it's been kind of like fragmented throughout the generations of the world. So maybe even following that logic in terms of reincarnation, and then even that I would even suggest like expands to truth, right? Like there's this kind of like passing of a light, right? That's, I think, how I was explained reincarnation, is that it's kind of like these candles, that like the one source of light doesn't extinguish and is replaced with the other, but it's carried on through, and it may take different shapes and forms and expressions, but that all comes from a certain source. So the same thing with truth, that we live maybe in a fragmented version of what that truth may be at its core, but there's still expressions of that truth that find and manifest throughout different mediums and modems. And I think that that's interesting, though, to see that really plain out and clear through people and through that idea of reincarnation, and that a person can exhibit characteristics of, let's say the soul or the Shema or person that they are reincarnated from, and that in itself, though, it's their own, right? It doesn't negate that their own individuality, but it is kind of a further expression. So I guess if that's making sense, and like kind of the logic of seeing that with truth and belief and spirituality and God, is that that expression may be seen in its own kind of colored and expressive in shape, but it does carry that same embodiment.
Yeah, it totally makes sense. And if you understand it like that, then I think everyone would agree with it. So this goes back to the question of what is God, like Rabbi David Aaron's books and YouTube clips. And if you understand it like that, then he actually likes to joke around that Kabbalah doesn't believe in God, because God denotes that rabbi in the sky kind of idea, and Kabbalah doesn't believe in that. Kabbalah believes in this energy source, this unity, this oneness. So it really depends on the term, which was what makes it so complicated. Just because we're using the same words doesn't mean we're at all talking about the same thing. So if you ask me if I believe in God, the question is, what is God? And by the way, just to throw it out there, go back to, the parsha, right? If you ask me whether or not I believe in God, you know what I would answer?
What?
Who is this God that you want me to believe in?
Nice.
And that was essentially, that was Paro's reply.
Yeah,
that was Paro's reply. Tell me who your God is, and then I'll tell you whether or not I believe in him.
Right. That's the intellectual pushback of belief, the logical pushback of belief. That knowledge.
I don't mean it just as a yes, but I don't mean it just as a logical pushback of belief. I mean as you have to define your terms before I can play the game, right? I have to know what you're asking me. How do you understand the idea of Avraham Avinu going through fire? Do you understand it literally? Do you understand it figuratively? Do you understand it? And once you tell me whether or not you understand it, how you understand it, then I can tell you whether or not that version of the understanding can exist within my framework, within my truth, or whatever, within my understanding of what's real and what's true. But first you have to tell me how you understand it.
It's interesting also, like with in biblical language, like when a husband knows his wife, right? Like it's like this, the following of that language, obviously it's talking about like an intimate reproductive context, just following that, but it's interesting that it uses that word, because dat and knowing something is that like pursuit of understanding it and comprehending it, and then therefore kind of making it a part of the self. And with knowing God, so yeah, maybe I take back that it's maybe a negative thing, the logical or intellectual pursuit of God. I think that it can't stand alone, because there has to be that, I guess, trust or I don't know, like faith and relationship with God. But knowledge, I guess, is a very important factor.
I'm going to go into knowledge and belief. There is this great Reb Nachman in Likutim that I believe also is in Hishtapchus HaNefesh, that where he says, contrary to what most people think, where Reb Nachman's like totally anti like thought and logic, and he's just like throw it all to the wind. He says most questions and problems can be solved with knowledge and logic. Almost all of them. And then he says that a small amount that come from like the beyond, he defines it as the makam hachalal, like the vacated space, like from the tzimtzum kind of. So there are questions that exist kind of within our world, and those questions you can answer with logic and thinking, if you think it over. But there are some that are like beyond this world, kind of. And he says for those you need tefillah, which for him is emunah. Emunah and tefillah are intertwined. Emunah zu tefillah.
It's beautiful.
So, but he doesn't mean that in the sense of like you throw a logic to the wind and you just believe. He means in this belief in the sense of the Jungian sense of belief, in my understanding, what Jordan Peterson talks about, which is that you act out kind of. I don't believe that you believe what you say you believe, is the way I would term it, way I would word it.
Why? Because someone doesn't understand what they're believing?
Because people say I believe things all the time, but then they don't act like it. So what does that mean? I say I believe in God, but I don't live a godly life. What does that mean? You believe in God and you don't live a godly life? That means it's a lip service.
Contradictory. Yeah.
But how do we resolve that contradiction? So some people, I go with this mode of thought, which is that you're paying a lip service, but you don't really believe. To really believe means you really believe it. Right? And your beliefs manifest themselves into reality. When I say, so I'm talking about something deeper. It's the same question of how we understand God, how we understand reincarnation. How do we understand the term belief? Is it just something, I believe this. Okay, nice. Or is it a core, like a core belief held at like the highest point of your psyche, right? If it's a core, if you really, let me just like throw it out, right? If you really believed that there was $1 million on the other side of that door right now, and it's disappearing in 20 seconds, you wouldn't be on right here talking to me right now, right? You'd be out of your seat with the door open. So if you really believe that there's a God and everything you do matters, and that whether or not you do mitzvot matter, and if you're a bad person, you're going to hell, if you really believe that, you wouldn't do what you're saying right now is going to make you go to hell. If you really believe that every cigarette you smoked, it would take off time from your life, you wouldn't be smoking a pack a day. You can quote the science. Oh yeah, it takes off. You don't really believe it. You just say it. Oh yeah, I'll live a little shorter. I don't believe people believe what they say they believe. Is the concept.
I agree 100%. I think that it's also Rabbi Elona Nava says this, but I'm sure a lot of people say this as well, is that like if you know what the mitzvot are, if you know what truth is, if you know what God is, then there's absolutely no excuse, and that's a very scary Musar kind of statement, but I think it rings really true, is that like you literally don't, like there's no kind of way around it, kind of circling back also that like the person's, to make them feel better, that justification of like, oh, what I'm doing is actually okay. It's a little bit of like, come on, like be real with yourself. Really exactly that, like say what you believe and live what you believe. I think that's Bezrat Hashem. That should be
but I kind of think I go the other way around. I think that you do live what you believe. And that you think you believe things that you don't really believe. That people think I believe in God. What does that mean? Who is this God? And people don't really know the answer to that question. So how do you really believe in it if you don't even know what you're talking about?
Right, but I think that there's the balance
I go the other way around.
Okay. Continue.
If you don't know what you believe in, then you don't believe in that necessarily. How can you not know? So again, we have to define these terms. But when I get to the term of defining belief, for me, it's something really, really deep. And everyone is just saying, "Well, I believe whatever." It's cheap. It's talk. It's not.
Mm-hmm.
You don't get to say we don't even know what we believe half the time. And I agree with these psychoanalysts who say, but if you watch carefully and you listen, you'll figure out what someone believes, right? You can say, "Oh, I'm the best," right? But if you watch the way someone acts, and you see they don't really believe that. They're doubting, they're questioning, they're not sure what they're doing, and the fact that we can say these things to me means nothing.
Maybe it's that, like, it's a more comforting and safe word to say rather than "I know," which is interesting because I think with God and truth and knowledge of the self or belief in the self, that I think they're interchangeable, or hopefully interchangeable. That, like, knowing something exists and believing something exists based off of the frequency of how it impacts my life, then yeah, they're the same. There shouldn't be a contradiction between my knowledge and my belief, or my emotions and my actions. Like, I think that's the essence of what we're about is living, breathing, acting in line with our thoughts and actions and beliefs. That's kind of like also that esoteric and what's the word, the like the debate of the self, basically, of like, am I my thoughts, am I my actions, how do I define myself, and how do other people define me? And I think that the true definition of oneself is the kind of alignment between the two. That if I can live the life that I believe I'm living, or I can say or think I'm living, then I'm truly myself, in a way, if that makes sense.
One of the examples I like to give for this concept, I like to give it for other ideas. It's like a good mashal to use as a framework. But basically, I still remember back in the day when I was like a yeshiva boy, right?
Wow.
Typical yeshiva boy. If you would have told me, listen, there are these two girls you could go out with, right? One of them is a really sweet, kind, caring, considerate, just amazing person, but she wears, t-shirts and jeans, right? The other girl, she's kind of mean, she's sort of obnoxious, she's inconsiderate, she doesn't like to help people, whatever, but she, wears long skirts and long sleeve shirts, right? I believe I would have told you, and I don't think I'm the only person who would have told you something like this. Something to the effect of, the first one is clearly a better person, clearly a better girl, right? But I wouldn't date her. She doesn't dress sneeze. So as much as I can acknowledge intellectually the first person is better than the second, I would say I don't actually believe that. For some weird reason, I have this belief that the second girl is better because she's wearing long sleeve shirts and a skirt. Now, my intellect can't reconcile that because it doesn't intellectually make any sense, right? So I would cede to you intellectually the first person is better, but in reality, I would not date the first person. I would date the second. That's since changed.
I don't think that's because of belief.
If you know any nice girl with t-shirts and jeans, let me know. I would word that as a belief. I've never used this mashal in this way. I usually use it just to show the schism, just to show the cognitive dissonance. But I would argue that the winner of the cognitive dissonance, kind of, is my core belief in a weird way.
I don't agree. I think that, I don't know. I can't speak for you, but.
Okay, so what's going on? Let's psychoanalyze. Go ahead.
Okay. So, I'm still processing it, but I think that, I think you bring up 2 points, to be honest. I think that, or maybe 3, but the 2 points right now that are here is that, like, what is making a good person, and obviously it's clear, like, between our actions, and then there's an idea of a certain lifestyle that a person may want or deem as best, right? Following what they've been taught, what they've been influenced in, and then, as you said, as something that you believe. However, I think that you believing that the girl who is wearing the long skirt but is a terrible person in her actions and in the way she treats people, I don't think that someone can fully believe within themselves that that is the better choice, because it's not, I think belief runs deeper than that. I think that you may have an influence or a pressure to go out with the girl that is wearing the long skirts because of an expectation, but that expectation is not yours alone. It's not produced singularly by you. That's kind of a buildup of an expectation and image, and and it's in the right sense where a person is ideally, let's say wearing the long skirts and is a good person, like following Jewish thought or whatever it is. So I think that to believe that someone is better because of how they look, that's also just a very superficial.
I think most of the beliefs that we hold are not ours. And that's why I say we don't really believe in it. You're holding on to someone else's beliefs or someone else's judgment, someone else's implicit biases. I would agree. That's how I would probably word it. Most of the beliefs that are, what's the expression? You're supposed to have strong beliefs loosely held. And some people have
Interesting.
Right, weak beliefs strongly held or something like.
I feel like, though, that belief is the one thing that cannot be replaced or changed, or, intellect, knowledge, even emotions can be
What happens when people change
manipulated and
religions?
changed.
Did they not change their belief?
No, they've changed their lifestyle. There's a belief, let's say, that there's a core.
You used to believe in Jesus, and now you used to believe in Muhammad. You used to believe in Moses. You used to believe in God. When someone's grows up religious, and very often they would say, "I believe in God," and then they decide they don't believe in God anymore. So obviously, yes, they changed their lifestyle. I'm not disagreeing with that, but I think they changed their core belief. Their what's the psychological literature term? Jordan uses this. You change the axiomatic presuppositions.
I would have never guessed that in my life. So cool.
The axiomatic
Say it one more time.
presuppositions. Axiomatic presuppositions.
Expecto
Basically,
Patronum.
my understanding very similar. Axiomatic means self-evident or unquestionable, and presuppositions are the things you presuppose. These are like your unquestionable, like core beliefs, kind of. That's the idea. Those can be be changed, and that. By the way, in Kabbalah, my understanding is what we call tikkun hakeser. Haketer. That's my understanding. Keter represents these axiomatic presuppositions. Keter represents that level of core belief, and then from there we start with chachma and bina and all that stuff.
Oh, like the kind of drizzled like expressions and explanations of that, so it's like more understandable. Is that what that means? Like there's Keter and then there's all the other midot. I need to explain that a little bit.
Keter is the axiomatic presuppositions, the ground of being. Keter is the processing system, kind of, and then chachma is the code that you put in, and then bina would be the algorithm, kind of.
Okay.
That kind of idea.
Okay.
So Keter represents like our core essence of being, and then the question is where's the problem? Is the problem in Keter? In other words, if something's going wrong, let's say with this schism of cognitive dissonance, something's going wrong. In other words, I'm ending up with the wrong decision. I'm picking the wrong girl. Right? I can sit here objectively, zoom out, take some drugs, and be like, "Yo, bro, you're about to marry the wrong girl. Don't do it." You know? What went wrong? Now let's go to the psychoanalyst and let's try to figure out, how did I end up in this point? I should have, because I always what went wrong. So now you're saying it could be societal pressure. On a certain level, it is societal pressure, right? But I think societal pressure has kind of changed my core axiomatic presuppositions, like before I even get to, like, it created implicit biases kind of idea.
But the fact that you're able to identify that girl as having negative traits, then there has to be still a sense of either its objectivity or your kind of awareness and understanding that those are negative qualities. I think belief, or maybe it's just the way that I understand belief, is kind of how the same way I see truth, the same way I see God, is that like we all have our own ways of interacting with it, but it's in itself is kind of withstanding and irreplaceable and unable to manipulate.
Again, it's hard to. Also, the question is like, are your beliefs yours and stuff like that, which is a whole nother rabbit hole to go down. Where do your beliefs come from? Stuff like that. Which again, Sam Harris is well aware of. A lot of these intelligent people are well aware of sociology and the fact that although it's perhaps not a hard science, the reality is most people born into a specific religion take on that religion. Most people born in a certain part of the world take on those political views, stuff like that.
Actually, it's interesting though, because the point you made earlier about Sam Harris that you disagree with, I think it's actually interesting because I think it's very prevalent in, I guess, the passing on of Torah information. I remember talking with my sister, who's 12, and she's like, how do we know that like we're the right ones? Like that classic question. And I remember asking that question. I remember being like really challenged by it when I was younger. And like, I remember kind of the answer I gave to her. I wonder if that would have been satisfactory for me when I was asking it. But I, was saying, oh, like, if there's a truth, there has to be kind of a universal understanding of it. There can't be something that's, if a lie, the truth always comes out. So a lie doesn't stand, right? Literally, even following the letters of sheker, right? There's this shin kuf resh, right? There's openings on all. They can't stand. And met, however, has that like strong foundation. Just even looking at the kind of beautiful design of the words, but something that I was saying to her is that a lie wouldn't be able to last that long. So even going back to what Sam Harris was, so I was talking about like with that, specifically with the receiving of the Torah, that like it's the same story consistently throughout thousands of years. Like there can't be questioning or with that questioning, the answer, kind of the proof is in the pudding. It's clear that that it's true. And I think that with Sam Harris, the interpretation of God, like there has to be, I'm not saying that there's a rabbi in the sky, but if everyone does have an association to God in that way, there has to be some essence of truth to that, No.
So let me start with the first point that you pointed out. And I'm going to throw a little like curveball into this thing because my understanding is that there, at the same time you were asking that question, there was a little kid in Guatemala who was born into a little cult called Lev Tahar.
Oh God.
And they were asking their cult leader the same question, and they received the same answer. Do you understand that? That's a problem.
I think that, however, it's the same thing of like recognizing and validating truth as truth, but even denying the truth or even manipulating
but again, we're
truth.
reading the book. What do you mean truth? What truth? In other words, in general, when your sister, the way she originally phrased the question was, how do we know we are the right ones? Right? Or something to that effect. Who's the we? Yeah. Because a bunch of people are holding the same book as you, and they all have very different versions of it. Not very different. Obviously, the core is the same as far as the text. But again, what you were saying before about belief with like the way you act out in the world. What were you saying? The way culture. What were you saying? The
way that we like
something
interact
about. Yeah, kind of. Can be very different. There were and it's not necessarily a bad thing. There were 12 tribes, right? They all had a little different way of going about things.
Yeah,
it's not necessarily problematic.
I don't think it's supposed to be homogenous.
Yeah. But I think that question, again, I think needs its terms defined first. How do we know that we are the right ones? My go-to reaction to that would be, who says you are? But you can be. You ever saw the opening scene of Newsroom? It's like a famous clip that went around YouTube. Some college girl gets up. I don't know if it's the opening scene, but some college girl gets up and there's 3 people on stage. One of them's like a news anchor, and the other 2 are
Oh, I
like
have
from
seen
different,
it.
I think different, also, right? And she asks him, "What makes America the best country in the world?" And the first person says, "Freedom, freedom, and more freedom." And second, right? And finally they're like, they ask him, and he's like, what they said, and they're like, no, we need a real answer. What makes America the most amazing country in the world? And he says, who says America is the most amazing country in the world?
Yeah.
But we can be. We sure used to be. That's how I view all these like we have the core, we have the truth, we have these texts, we have what we need, and we can use them. We can bring Mashiach as long as we don't sit back and say Mashiach's coming.
Totally, I agree in the interaction with it, but then again, that's also I think then we're agreeing, or maybe not, I don't know, but I think that I'm not saying that that like accepting the receiving of the Torah is our solid proof. I think that there's proofs in everything of God, but recognizing and validating that if that's what we believe, if let's say someone is, and trying not to use the word belief, but let's say that we're accepting Torah as truth, and that is the basis of my choices, my thought process, my lifestyle, right? Then with that, I have to accept, as to not live a contradiction, that my life should not be contradictory to my thoughts or beliefs or interpretations of things. So I have to believe that the receiving of the Torah on Mount Sinai is a universal truth to, I guess, Jewish belief, and that there isn't a way of denying that.
That I'm good with, but I don't. But on a certain level,
You don't have to be.
no, I agree with you. As much as it pains me to say, I agree with you.
Just admit it.
The only question is like, and what does that
I'm
mean
the first
to
one on the
us
podcast.
now? Kind of. What does that mean to us
Well, of
now?
course.
Kind of thing. Like that's the question. So it's. I don't want to say this for totally taking out of context, but on a certain level, like to me, that's irrelevant.
Right,
The
and
giving of the Torah
I
to
actually
me
agree with
is
you too, that it's irrelevant unless we live that lifestyle now, unless we live a life believing the same. If we can't take the full board and we can't apply that to our life, then yeah, what's the point? 1000%.
I mean, yeah. To me, again, the question, like another example, are Jews better than non-Jews?
There's even
To
that,
me,
like,
the simple answer is show me the Jew, show me the non-Jew, and then I'll tell you what I think is better. It has nothing to do with, there's no like, oh yeah, blanket, yes, they're better than them. We're dealing with individuals. No part of that is remotely appropriate.
that's the same thing. That's a core belief. If you take 2 girls, one wears pants and one wears skirts, right? Then there is that belief in objectivity and assessment of human nature, right? That a person would rather, and maybe that's rooted in belief in the self, belief in a love, belief in connection, belief in humanity, all of those things that are fueled, I think, by godliness and by that truth, that it isn't contradictory to believe that someone is righteous because they're a good person but wear pants. It's not a but, like they wear pants and are a righteous person. I don't think that it's mutually exclusive. I think that following halacha is a beautiful thing and it's a way that people can connect, but I don't think someone's a bad person unless they do like things that are bad in terms of humanity. Yeah.
Interesting. Just another curveball. The halachic question as to how tznius works and when it works and whether it's societal. Or, like that's a very complicated question. Right. And I have a friend whose grandfather is like a big posek. He like renders Jewish legal decisions, and he is not so sure that girls can't wear pants anymore. Because he's like, so it's such a normal thing at this point that that
it's no longer just beged ish and stuff like that.
Yeah, it's just everyone wears pants, which is in general is a good question. In general, not regarding, right? In other words, this idea
Yeah.
of good or bad, even from a like Torah perspective, you need to know first the truth is what they're doing, is what they're doing wrong in the first place. Then also, obviously, there's whether or not they think it's wrong, which is also very important. It's the whole like Pia Setzner on Pinchas, right?
But even going back a little bit with it's hard for me because I feel like kind of split between, I guess, what I believe and or maybe it's two different beliefs actually, like believing that halacha and mitzvot and Torah are supposed to be a personal interpretation, are supposed to be reflected one among the other, but at the same time I think that that could also be problematic because that's also kind of a change and evolution that may not have necessarily meant to be implied, and I don't know if or like intended. I don't know if that's true or not, but I guess it's just scary for me to fully commit to that, in saying that like certain halachot, like some people say that, oh, we halachically, we're at some point it was a decision whether or not we were allowed to use our phones on Shabbat. And, it was just chosen that they weren't allowed to use their phones on Shabbat. But now to kind of be like, okay, well, then let's like revisit that and question that and see if, halachically, then it makes sense that, oh, we actually can use our phones on Shabbat. I think that's a scary kind of slippery slope type of way of looking into halacha and Torah and I guess Jewish lifestyle in general. I don't think things were meant to be dissected and then discarded. Maybe dissected and ingested and applied, but not necessarily discarded because it doesn't fit a certain logical or cultural norm.
You cut out for like random parts of that.
Oh,
I'm just trying to piece it all together.
Whatever.
I'm assuming it's all there in the recording. I heard most of it.
Okay.
Yeah, there's definitely an interesting dichotomy in general with like halacha and the legalist versus the prophet, that kind of idea.
Mm-hmm.
Again, there's this concept though that I do think that the legalist wants to follow the letter of the law, and the prophet comes and says that's not the spirit of the law. Kind of always, like that's not always the way it works, but
like Shamar v'Zachor.
In other words, yeah, like even with Noach, I think they were stealing things that were less than a shava pruta or something, right? You know what I'm talking about?
I wish I knew.
I think that's one of the things they say. Like legally, they were stealing, but they were stealing in ways that they were technically legally exempt from repaying.
Oh, interesting.
But that's not always you can work within the law and still go against the law, kind of, And that's the idea of the prophet coming to say, listen, yeah, you checked all your boxes, but you completely missed the boat, on a certain level. That's one of the things the prophet does.
Yeah, but the prophet was also meant to, okay, just getting defensive. Okay.
I'm not disagreeing, but sometimes within the weeds or within the framework of the legalities, as you're going through the letter of the law, you can lose the spirit of the law. That's like one of the concepts. I had a certain level. I had this discussion Friday night with someone because I have wine, which is Kedushat Shviit, which is the Shemitah year wine, and it's holy, right? And they were like nervous to drink it. And we got into this discussion, and I'm like, you have to just don't spill it out. Don't treat it, disrespectfully or whatever, but you should be normal about it, because what happens is when you're not normal about it and you get all OCD, then instead you just end up buying perot and yirakot and buying fruits and vegetables from outside of Eretz Yisrael, which I don't think was ever the intention. Like my mini rant, sometimes within the legalities, you build such a legal framework that you totally lose the big picture of like what's going on here. You know,
I agree 100%. I think that like it's the need and necessity of both, even in terms of like sanctifying certain things, like with Moshe Rabbeinu and being separate from Tzipora. Like I don't know if that was necessarily the intention or needing to be close or far, but it's actually interesting because I was learning this recently. I think through Charlie Harari. He has a beautiful Dvar Torah like video on Tisha B'Av. He was talking about reframing the idea of what chet is. And chet, like, in the most elementary explanation, is a sin. So it's like, okay, like there's a sin and then there's a consequence, right? And then there's chayv and all of that balance that we are taught. But he was saying that like reevaluating chet and understanding it as a separation, which in essence is its true definition, because the first sin of Adam Arishon is a separation, right? The separation of soul and body, the separation of man and God, of even honesty and hastara and hiding things. That I think that there's that concept of really like transcribing that and really understanding that in a very real time thing is that like the real sin is separating. The real sin is not associating the halacha with the spirit, or vice versa, the spirit with halacha. I think that like the two of those really need each other. And again, this just, I guess, is just fresh on my mind, but just back to the whole mitzvot of women, that there just needs to be a sanctuary between the space of those two that brings them together. And I think that that in itself is Geulah, to be free of the idea that one can contradict the other,
Yeah, I don't think it's that one can contradict the other. It's that you could be so caught up with one that you overlook the other. I think is more how I would word it. Something to that effect. Because you can cover your elbows and wear a skirt down to the floor and totally not be tzniut, right? And you can wear a t-shirt and shorts and be the most tzniut person in the world. So it's not like a now that again, that doesn't mean you shouldn't do what, like,
but by definition, I guess, like tzniut in that metaphor is both. Like it is through spirit and observance, I guess.
Yeah, the answer is always yes.
I'm not the spokesperson for tzniut, but yeah.
The answer is always yes. Is it this or is it that? The answer is yes, right? But I'm saying you can be, again, it works for everything on a certain level, right? You could be so caught up with studying that you forget to practice.
It's like the new shoes metaphor of like keeping them in the box and never wearing them.
Yeah. You can be, again, on a certain level, you could say it's like a Shimba Yochai trip when he leaves the cave. Like you could be so immersed with spirituality that like you're burning up, the physicality, which is also like a problem, So it's about maintaining that healthy balance and fusing them together on a certain level, which is really, again, like you were saying, that's Mashiach. When you're talking about Mashiach ben Yosef and Mashiach ben David, you also mentioned you mentioned Zechar. This is Yechezkel, I think. Yechezkel has a nevuah where God tells him to take two sticks, and he writes on one Mate Ephraim or something, and the other one the Ephraim, and the other one he writes Li Yehuda, I think. Right? One is Ephraim, which is one of the sons of Yosef. So one is representing Mashiach ben Yosef, the masculine, this and that. The other one is Yehuda. It's representing David, who's from the lineage of Judah. And God tells him, turn them into one, intertwine the sticks. That it's going to be, there's going to be this unity.
It's beautiful.
And yeah, just like it's the masculine and the feminine, it's also, the physical and the spiritual, which on a certain level that is masculine and feminine. Right? It's the same like dichotomy of the yin yang.
Nachon. I guess, I'm biting my tongue now because
it's the spirit of the law.
But I think that like the validation that is the same thing. Like for me, it's easier to understand with poles that I feel like are more equal, I guess, in that way, like masculine, feminine energy. But then when I have to apply that also to spirituality and physicality. Like they both have an important impact. It's not about like, and you and I have spoken about this before, but also Rabbi David Aaron, all about like the ideas of, it's not about physically elevating. It's about like spiritually translating through physical means, I guess, and like manifesting spirituality through the physical. And so it would need to be a valid vessel. It's interesting.
Yeah, again, it's the one becoming two to become one again kind of thing. Yeah, and it's not that you can't have both simultaneously, and that you shouldn't have both simultaneously. Obviously you should. It's just, for me, I think it's very often we put the focus somehow in the wrong spot. Now, I'm not saying you can't have both, right? I'm not saying you can't be an amazing person, kind, sweet, generous, and also be very well studied. I'm just saying sometimes in the effort to study, we ignore everything that needs to get done. On a certain level, this is perhaps you can argue this is like Chassidus versus.
I was about to say that.
What happened to the Litvish. What were you about? Yeah, go ahead. Take it away.
I was about to say, no, it reminded me of there's a Hasidic story of a Rebbe in his Talmud, or a Chassid learning, and the Chassid's like really into it, and he loves it, and he's really immersed within the learning, and it's kind of overcoming. And the Rebbe immediately tells him to stop the learning and to kind of take a break from the steig that he's immersed in. And the chassid is like, why? Like, this is my life. I'm being who I am. This is the most true, expression of myself that I could ever be. This is the highest of high through learning this Torah. And the Rebbe says, like, there's a baby crying next door. And in essence, if a person can't hear a child or a person, for that matter, crying when immersed in Torah, then they're not really learning anything. So the Torah that we're learning right now is nothing. And so I think, Chassidut is like this sweet, glaze of Torah that was needed, and kind of that healing experience that. And I'm not like discrediting, I think, Litvish and more, I guess, like the black and white interpretations of Torah, we need those, like literally even in like the, I guess, scientific or spiritual explanations of color, right? You need black and white. They need to absorb color. They need to reflect color. Like they all,
I don't think their Torah
together.
I don't think their Torah is very different. It's a question of Seder Adifuyot. It's a question of how you're going to act now. It's not a question of they learn the same morals and the same lessons as we do. The question is how you go about internalizing them. In other words, they all agree that Avraham Avinu was sitting in his tent talking to God, and then these three wayfarers came by, and he said, "Gotta go." No one disagrees. But now, how do you live your life like that? Or do you tell everyone that they have to wait because you're going to learn? Now, there are those concepts also. I'm not disagreeing. Like, it's both true. In other words, if you
right, like
if
I
you
don't
only
want to
work,
judge
then
each group.
That's what I'm here for, right? If you, I'm not disagreeing, but there are certain things that to me, I mean, there's a certain Torah, let's say from I believe it's the Chafetz Chaim, on Eina Torah Miskayim Al Misha Memes Atzmo Alao. The Torah only stays by somebody who kills themselves over it. And he says, just tell everyone else that you're dead, and they shouldn't give you any responsibility, and go learn Torah, kind of thing.
That's what the Chafetz Chaim's interpretation is.
There is that concept. That's I don't know if it's an interpretation or it's a Torah on that concept. He says, like, imagine every day your wife wants you to work more and more, That way, you can make more and more money. And tell her, like, imagine I was dead. What would you do?
Oh my God.
You would run the business without me. Okay, so go run the business without me. I'm going back to the base Midrash. Something to that effect.
I don't know. I don't know about that, so I don't know.
I
That's hard
don't
for me
relate to that
to
at all.
connect
Now
to.
I don't.
Yeah.
Now, but conceptually, the idea of something has to be sacrificed. You can't do everything at once, right?
Mm-hmm.
So the reality is, if you really, really, really want to make it, in intellectual studies, very often you have to sacrifice some of the economic side, or vice
Mm-hmm.
versa. If you really want to grow a scale a big business, make it financially, then you're gonna have to sacrifice some of your studies. That I definitely relate to on a certain level.
Yeah, I think that like that words can be interpreted differently, because it's interesting when you say like to kill yourself over Torah. I think that maybe there could also be the understanding, and of course everyone will interpret it the way that they will, but Jewish thought also believes that embarrassing someone is like killing them, and so there's also maybe the expulsion of the ego with Torah, and killing maybe the self-righteousness of how a person may see themselves by being a Talmud Chacham or being a
Ego
big
death.
Rebbe. So yeah, and I think that then that's probably really necessary for Torah learning, because there needs to be not complete desecration of the self, but definitely kind of humility in order to accept and be open to understanding. Actually, though, something that you were talking about before of like understanding Avraham Avinu and how it could be like, oh, just learning or chesed. I heard a beautiful Torah on Shabbat, like just phenomenal Torah, the way that this guy was speaking. But he was saying that the Mishkan and the Beit HaMikdash were kind of these, according to the Ramban, I believe he was quoting that the Rambam on Parshat Shmot, that the Mishkan and the Beit HaMikdash were kind of like these fillers and substitutes for what was intentionally intended. That it was that the spiritual, that Hashem kind of looked at Am Yisrael and was like, okay, like these people need a central place for worship and connection and spirituality. So they need a Mishkan in the desert, and then they need a Beit HaMikdash in their sovereign country. But the intent, that was kind of just a filler for what the Ohale of Avraham Avinu, Yitzchak and Rivka, and Rachel and Yaakov, and each of theirs was really just their homes. They didn't need a central place that they would go to. They didn't need the shul. They didn't need the Beit Midrash. They had it within their homes, and I think that that's something maybe that gets lost a little bit also through Torah study and passing on throughout the generations. That it's like, okay, we're moving to build the Beit Mikdash when Mashiach comes. We're moving to have a central place, but a part of bringing that Mashiach, and the way that he phrased it was being Geulah Jews instead of Galut Jews, is that when we make it into our own homes and we make a mikdash of the self, and then obviously making our home like Avraham and Sarah, a home of Chesed, Yitzchak and Rivka, a home of Avodah, Tefillah, and Rachel and Yaakov, a home of learning Torah. All of those characteristics, all of those intentions, like that is in itself a building of the mikdash, and so. To learn Torah and to not apply that to life, in essence, is staying in that galut. So not to judge, I guess, people who live like that, but
there's also the concept of va'asuli mikdash v'shachanti b'tochem. They'll build a mikdash and I'll live inside them. B'toch kol echad be'echad. Then it means like inside every person. Like I'll live within their hearts, within their psyche. The idea of like the inner temple. That's like the B'tochechi Yerushalayim kind of
I was
song
just
that I
thinking
wrote.
that.
What was the third stanza? I'm empty, I'm broken, I'm in sorrow, I'm in pain. The good in me is exiled. My temple's up in flames. How again, like that's the same. That's like the Bechina. That's like the same thing existing on multi-fractal like dimensions.
Like
There's
it's so
the
hard
galut
also.
of the self. There's the galut of the people.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. There's the galut. By the
That's
way,
amazing.
incidentally, just point out that the Chazal say that the Torah is also in Gullus right now.
I believe that. Yeah.
That Torah itself is in Gullus, and that's the whole idea also of we don't, the Levana is not the same, the moon is not the same as the sun. We're not 100% sure how to understand everything, and we're
Mm-hmm.
losing the teachings. That's also the other song, the Meshech Ben Yosef song. How did it? The last stanza is Gullus is tough. We often lose the truths we knew. It's not just us. The Torah is here in Gullus too. I pray that somehow we make it through. And then it's every fractal is a story on its own, sometimes, because again, it's the same like multi-dimensional galut going on. I wrote like a
Mm-hmm.
blog post about this at some point. I think I sent it to you,
Oh,
but not
maybe I read
100%
it.
sure about, no,
No, I
about
think
Gullus,
about.
about like the cross-dimensional. I wrote again about how we went into Gullus, Torah went into Gullus. People were exiled, but we were really exiled from ourselves, from our true teachings,
Mm-hmm.
from our true Torah, and then it's a cross-dimensional fractal Gullus, and then hopefully it'll also be like a fractal Geulah. But again, like that Geulah starts from within ourselves.
Mm-hmm.
Like it's really inside out, I think. What's going on is, in other words, we're breaking down. There's the breakdown on the level of the individuals, and then the breakdown on the level of individuals then grows to the breakdown of the level of the group, and then the group spreads to the nation, and then
Mm-hmm.
at that point, that's so. In other words, we see it now on the nation level. The nation gets exiled, but the nation is exiled
Right.
because the individuals. The breakdown was on a small level, and the tikkun needs to be on a small level also.
Nachon, like in order to know redemption, we also have to understand galut. But it's interesting because I think though that I think that's after analysis. But on the first hand, I think that Mashiach or general redemption is very much framed through kind of shleimut, through this kind of all-encompassing, all the sick will be healed, all the broken will be fixed, and so it's harder to, I think, for me to understand what that means, like in a fractal kind of way.
Why? There's the let's say there's the sick, right? There's the sick
Mm-hmm.
society. Society is sick, and then there are people who are actually
Mm-hmm.
sick, and then there are sometimes you're sick in the head, right?
Mm-hmm.
And then sometimes the world is sick. Sometimes the world around us, the ground is sick, right? Sometimes
Mm-hmm.
things aren't growing. You could have sickness in every dimension. Animals can be sick, people can be sick, plants can be sick, right? And then it could be spiritually
Yeah.
sick, it could be physically sick. There's just sickness all around. No, I'm kidding. Chas.
No, it's true. I think, but that in essence though is kind of again like recognizing Geulah in Galut is saying that all can be healed because like all that sickness is connected. It's not that plant is isolated sick and person is sick in an isolated manner. There's obviously kind of a interconnected nature of that sickness, and then vice versa with the healing. So I guess yeah, like just as something is, and it's Rabbi Nachman, I guess, if you believe something can be broken, then you must believe it can be fixed. That they're completely two in one. That's cool.
Yeah. Are you familiar with Aubrey Marcus? Aubrey Marcus is this really cool dude who had like a spiritual
Mm-hmm.
experience, and he talks about all these spiritual concepts and manifestations of archetypes and all these things. And he has a couple friends who are
Mm-hmm.
actually well versed in Kabbalah. He has them on podcasts. So he talks about also like
Oh
Kabbalistic
wow, cool.
concepts. But he says stories also from all spiritual traditions. And he says over a story about a rain man from somewhere. I think it was like in the Amazon, like some far in, somewhere way out there. There was no rain, and they brought in the rain man, and from a different area, from a different region.
Sounds familiar.
And he comes in, he spends a couple days in a hut, and it rains, right? So they ask him what just happened? Something, right? Like, what is this real? Like, what's going on? And he says something to the effect, I'm paraphrasing, I haven't seen this video in a long time, something to the effect of, I came from a place where everything was in order. And there was rain, right? And now I come to a place where things are out of order and there's no rain. So I went and I restored order within myself, and the rain came. Something like trippy like that. Like when I got here, I became dysregulated because of this environment.
Right.
But once I re-regulated myself, I was able to push it back to the environment kind of trip.
Yeah, fair.
It is the way he says it. First of all, he's a great voice also.
I can see that. I think meditative kind of.
Very
that's
soothing.
Beautiful. I think actually, yeah. I was thinking with even going back to Betochachi Yerushalayim, Rav Ezra Micha Amichai said this one time, on a Shabbaton, that I thought was so beautiful, that he was asking what Yerushalayim broken down within those two words is Yerusha and Shalem, and Yerusha meaning an inheritance, and Shalem being completion or wholeness. And so he's saying what is your Yerusha, what is your Shalem, what were you given, what's your inheritance, and then how do you make it Shalem? And I think that with that though, recognizing within the phrase of Betochachi Yerushalayim is within me I have ancestral ancient potential, and what was given to me, and then also with my individual interaction with that, and how do I make that shalem. And the same thing expanded to the world is that we've been given this world, we've been given all the things, the natural way of things, science, elements, different bechinot, I guess, of what godliness is, and how do we find shlemut in that, how do we find order, how do we find wholeness and oneness in that. And that I think is a very empowering thing. I think that it's kind of also that balance of, in one pocket, the world was created for you, and in the other pocket, you're nothing but dust. That a person could look at the world and say, wow, there's so much here, there's so much to I guess interact with. I have nothing. I'm just kind of this random cell in an organism, or behefech, kind of what that guy was saying, is that it was his alignment, his kind of internal and introspective focus that was able to heal his surroundings. And I think that Judaism is all about that. It's the Rav Soloveitchik, or not Rav Solanter, that I tried to heal the world. So I tried to fix my community, I tried to fix my town, but eventually learning that just fixing the self. And that's the same thing I think even with what the Torah was said on Shabbat, that it's the home, fixing the ohel, the mikdash me'at, instead of the not instead, but I guess in the first step to building the grander mikdash.